Have you ever scrolled through your social feed or maybe spent hours online and just wondered how much of you is actually reflected back? How much of your identity, your thoughts, even your emotions are being shaped or maybe mediated by the screens you're looking at?
It's a really deep question, yeah. And it's one that Tao Lin's 2013 novel, Taipei, just dives right into, I think, with astonishing depth. We're talking about a book that, when it first came out, critics often dismissed, called it effectless, artless, even, well, boring.
Exactly. But what if those things, those supposedly boring qualities, aren't really flaws? What if they're actually the point? Like, what if they reveal something really profound about our digital age and maybe even about narrative itself?
Right.
So our mission today really is to unpack how Lin's narrative strategies in Taipei embody what some critics call a post-humanist aesthetics of exhaustion. It really challenges our traditional ideas of the human self.
Yeah, and this isn't just, literary homework. It's about understanding how we build our own identities, how we tell our own stories in a world that's just increasingly shaped by technology. We'll explore how Taipei kind of dissects reason, emotion, and purpose in this new mediated reality.
Get ready to maybe rethink what it means to be human now in the digital age.
Definitely.
Okay, so to really get a grip on how Lin does this, maybe we should start by setting the philosophical stage. We need to talk about humanism, transhumanism, and then this critical leap into posthumanism. How do these actually differ, especially thinking about what it means to be human?
That's a crucial distinction to make. Humanism, at its core, it places immense value on humans. It emphasizes our rationality, our agency, our sort of unique spot in the world. It's all about human potential, progress.
Right. And transhumanism, as I understand it, it's not about ditching humanism, is it? It's more like pushing those humanist ideas even further, like humanism 2.0 maybe.
Precisely. Yeah, hyperdrive is a good way to put it. Transhumanism wants to overcome our current biological limits, our cognitive limits. But it does that by subscribing to the idea that humans are primary. It's about enhancing what we already are, improving rationality, speeding up progress, keeping that optimistic view of what humanity can become, especially with technology, like upgrading the OS.
Okay, got it. So if transhumanism is about enhancement, where does posthumanism come in? Because that feels like the territory Taipei is really exploring.
It absolutely is. Posthumanism isn't trying to enhance humanism. It's critically looking at it and trying to move beyond its basic assumptions. It comes from like a new awareness of the limits of those old anthropocentric, human-centered ways of thinking. It tries to dismantle the kind of either thinking we fall into, mind versus body, human versus non-human. The philosopher Francesca Ferrando talks about dismantling dualistic relational ontology, basically questioning those traditional divides that shape how we see reality. It's a critical approach. It decentralizes the human.
Wow, that's a huge shift. And it's fascinating to think how these big philosophical changes, like rethinking what human even means, could possibly impact something like storytelling. I mean, if narratives construct how we understand ourselves, our subjectivity, then changing how we see humanity must change how stories get told, right? How they show the self.
Absolutely. The whole fabric of storytelling has to adapt when our idea of human shifts. And, well, that brings us straight to Paul, the protagonist of Taipei. He's been described as a technologically and drug-mediated, third-person omniscient pseudo-biographical projection of Tao Lin himself.
So almost like Lin's avatar in this digital world.
You could say that, yeah. Paul exists within this digitally saturated landscape.
It sounds like Paul is maybe less a character with, deep internal struggles and more just a reflection of his surroundings. The novel's plot, I've heard, is almost static, like an extended portrait mediated by drugs and tech.
That's pretty much it. And the key thing here, the takeaway, is that because of this constant mediation, the only Paul we ever see is the one shaped by his diverse technological and biological symbioses. You don't get an unmediated Paul. His existence is defined by these interactions.
Right. No pure self underneath. This idea, this absence of an unmediated Paul, it reminds me of Jennifer Moore's concept of a poetics of failure. She argues it's kind of a response to older, maybe exhausted narrative techniques. It's characterized by neutrality, incoherence, inconsequence.
And that poetics of failure points directly to the exhaustion of what we usually think distinguishes humans. Reason, emotion, purpose. Taipei, in a lot of ways, is like a narrative performance of that very exhaustion.
Okay, so now that we've got Paul on the stage, let's break down this aesthetics of exhaustion. Let's start with the first pillar. How Taipei challenges our usual understanding of reason. The narrative uses indirect free speech, which normally pulls us closer to a character's thoughts. But here, the third-person view seems to create this distance from Paul, like we're watching him think, not thinking with him.
You've really hit on something critical there. What's significant is how Paul's focus keeps shifting. It suggests maybe mental operations that feel like attention deficit disorder from all the technological hyperstimulation. But as the source points out, it might also be a deliberate self-conscious pose, a refusal to give expression to human subjectivity as a coherent one.
Ah, so not just a symptom of the times, but potentially a statement about the modern mind. He's hyper self-conscious, almost to the point where even his unconscious seems constructed. Like his social interactions are artificial, often drug-mediated. Does that mean his self is sort of externalized?
Exactly. It makes any apparent human need or motivation seem like it comes from the drugs or the tech, not from Paul himself. His extreme self-consciousness covers everything, even what we think of as his inner, unmediated self. He's constantly observing, recording his own existence, often while on drugs, so he can analyze it later. He's not just living, he's like curating and documenting his own being.
Which leads to that really striking example. Preparing for his book tour, Paul makes a 7-page drug itinerary, meticulously planning the exact amounts, the types of substances, MDMA, LSD, benzos, opiates he'd take before almost every single event. What does that tell us about his rationality?
That itinerary is just a perfect illustration. It shows this hyper self-consciousness, this mediation of his rationality. For Paul, rationality isn't some inherent human-defining thing. Instead, it gets deflected onto these infrahuman chemical and technological devices.
Right.
His whole decision-making process is kind of outsourced. It becomes a function of these external things. And that lines up perfectly with a post-human perspective. You know, it exhausts those old binaries between pure human reason and just like technological or chemical enhancement.
Yeah.
His being is completely mediated, blurring the lines of what reason even is.
So if reason is exhausted, what happens to emotion? Traditionally, in humanist thought, emotion is a huge marker of being human. It separates us from animals, from machines. Think of all the great books driven by big emotional journeys. But in Taipei, it's different.
Very different, yeah. Paul's emotions are described as significantly minimalistic, not just in Taipei, but really across Lin's work. The novel seems to pointedly avoid those traditional emotional arcs, even when it seems like there are obvious opportunities.
Like his visits to Taipei, he's a second-generation immigrant. There's his relationships, his marriage, his career as a writer. These are usually gold mines for emotion in literature. But Taipei just keeps this emotional neutrality, right?
Yeah.
That's the main tone.
It is, yeah. It's pervasive, and the effect on the reader is specific, often frustrating. It creates a kind of judgmental emotional detachment. You find yourself judging Paul, maybe seeing him as cold, apathetic, or even feeling sorry for him, exactly because the narrative refuses that traditional emotional connection.
It blocks identification.
Right. It's a deliberate choice that exhausts that humanist idea of a self based on deep feeling.
I found a passage that really seems to capture this. It describes Paul interacting with his girlfriend, Erin, after he finds out she's been seeing her ex, Beau. Paul's lying next to her in bed, and he meekly pawed her forearm 3 times, then briefly held some of her fingers, which were surprisingly warm. Then he imagines this whole romantic thing, waking up, embracing, kissing, brought together naturally like plants that join at their roots. Very poetic.
Very conventional even. But then what happens?
Then, after just a few minutes, he's unable to sleep in his increasingly tense position. He rolled over and gathered a blanket into a cushiony bunch, which he held like a stuffed animal of a brain, and slept facing a wall. A stuffed animal of a brain.
Yeah, it's such a jarring image. It perfectly shows his shy tenderness and controlled detachment, like the source says. That imaginative, highly conventional, poetic, romantic narrative just collapses. It gets replaced by this almost absurd detached image. It really points to the exhaustion of the textual function of emotion as a structural motif. Emotion seems performative here, maybe not deeply felt or structuring.
It's an incredibly lonely moment visually, but the writing itself seems to keep us at arm's length from the feeling. I remember some early critiques used the word autistic. Now, interestingly, this emotional detachment led critics like Sue to talk about autistic jouissance. Can you unpack that a bit? What does that mean here?
Right, and it's really important to be clear here. When Sue uses autistic jouissance, it's not meant in a clinical way at all. It's an aesthetic concept. It describes a kind of pleasure, an aesthetic pleasure, that comes from being detached from conventional desire and meaning.
Okay.
So in this view, artistic communication gets reduced to basically a phatic function. Like when you say hello on the phone just to check if the line's open, not to actually say anything meaningful.
Testing the channel.
Exactly. It's about testing the connection, confirming there's a channel, but not necessarily conveying deep meaning or emotion.
Yeah.
It kind of reframes that initial autistic critique as a deliberate aesthetic strategy.
Which brings us neatly to the third pillar, the exhaustion of purpose. Lin's narrative seems to signal a total exhaustion of purpose. There's no inherent goal, no ultimate direction, no teleology for Paul or the plot. His motivations aren't just hard to figure out. His apathy isn't some deep existential quest.
No, his life just feels directionless. He himself feels, and this is a quote, like a digression that had forgotten from what it digressed. There's no bigger picture, no grand plan or arc guiding what he does.
That makes perfect sense. So all his activities, checking email, scrolling social media, parties, drug use, traveling, they don't seem to have any purpose but to simply take place. They're just connected by this boring repetition of a common pattern of inconsequence. And as a reader, apparently, you find it virtually impossible to organize plot into any coherent development. The massive attention to detail doesn't really reward you with substantial meaning.
And again, this feels like a deliberate aesthetic choice. Yeah. There's that long party scene, for instance, where Paul indiscriminately moved fried beans, guacamole, 3 kinds of chips onto a roof, eats it all, then tries to eavesdrop on a conversation he can't even hear. The details are so specific, almost aggressively pointless, and the sentences can be really convoluted. It's not about figuring out the plot. It's about experiencing that sense of inconsequence, that lack of forward momentum. This aesthetic just refuses to make any teleological claim at all. It can definitely be an exhausting read, but maybe that exhaustion is the point. It mirrors Paul's own feeling of purposelessness.
Okay, so we have this exhaustion of reason, emotion, and purpose. But how does this actually create artistic value? How does it lead to this distinct post-human aesthetic, this narrative performance?
Well, Sue and Grady observed what they called an object-centered rather than subject-centered ontology in Lin's work. Which sounds weird, right? Because the novel seems so focused on Paul's interpersonal experiences.
Yeah, it seems contradictory.
But it stops being contradictory if subjectivity itself, the idea of the self, gets reformulated.
You mean if the self isn't just locked inside the human mind?
Exactly. If subjectivity extends out to include non-human others, if it's seen as a kind of universal sentience that for Paul gets materialized in his MacBook screen, his identity, his self, isn't just internal anymore. It's profoundly externalized, distributed. This points towards a kind of post-aesthetics, a reconfiguration of art that isn't traditionally expressive or representative or even creative in the old sense. It matches a truly post-humanist subjectivity.
So it's not just that Paul uses his MacBook. The MacBook is almost like a part of his self, an extension. And this really seems to culminate in the novel's final passage, doesn't it? After a marital crisis, Paul overdoses, and he has these intense digital hallucinations. He sees water as an instantaneous column of binary variations. Surfaces have greater pixelation.
Yeah, that's a pivotal moment. It's often interpreted as Paul experiencing a kind of digital singularity. His human self gets reconfigured. Maybe he's living a sort of transhuman utopia. He thinks something like, with an eternity to practice, he would forget everything he had thought or felt while dead. He would only believe, as he once had, that he was alive.
It's got this intended indeterminacy, right? It's deliberately ambiguous, open to interpretation, but it definitely leans towards seeing Paul's life itself as a kind of work of art.
And that's where the artistic power lies, I think.
Yeah.
Despite exhausting those core humanist categories, reason, emotion, purpose, Lin's narrative gains immense artistic value precisely because it's a narrative performance that perfectly mirrors this post-human subjectivity. Ben Lerner really nailed it when he noted the astonishingly realistic effect and the force of the real that Lin achieves in depicting contemporary consciousness, or maybe the lack of it.
So what does this all boil down to for us, for the listener? Taipei isn't just some story about a guy doing drugs and checking his email constantly. It's this meticulously built mirror reflecting a world where our very sense of self is mediated, reconfigured, maybe even exhausted.
Indeed. It signals the exhaustion of that old humanist paradigm, not as a failure necessarily, but as an artistic performance that embraces a post-humanist way of understanding subjectivity, one that's overtly constructed, hyper self-conscious, and deeply integrated with technology and chemistry.
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? In a world where our daily lives are so increasingly mediated by screens, by devices, by endless digital interactions, how much of our own self is actually a carefully constructed narrative performance? And how much is some kind of unmediated truth, if that even exists anymore? What parts of this post-human narrative self, the one we see in Taipei, do you recognize in your own current digital culture?
It's definitely a question worth pondering long after you finish the book or, turn off the screen. It forces us to confront how much of our inner lives are now externalized and what that really means for who we think we are.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. We hope you'll maybe look at the digital world and perhaps even yourself just a little differently after this. Thanks so much for joining us.